This webcast is titled How SharePoint Works. My name is Randy Driscoll, and I'm a Microsoft MVP for SharePoint Server. Also, I am the Branding and Design Lead for SharePoint 911. The webcast will focus on a brief overview of how SharePoint 2010 works behind the scenes. Some of the topics we'll cover include operating system requirements, SQL Server requirements, browser support, SharePoint administration changes, as well as we'll cover some important terms for SharePoint 2010. So let's get started. We'll begin by talking about some of the Windows requirements for SharePoint 2010. SharePoint 2010 is only available in 64-bit versions. This means that all hardware running SharePoint will need to be 64-bit, as well as the operating system and SQL versions running on the hardware. In other words, SharePoint 2010 is 64-bit across the board. In order to install SharePoint, the 64-bit version of Windows 2008 with Service Pack 2 or the 64-bit version of Windows Server 2008 R2 will need to be installed on the servers. For development environments, SharePoint 2010 can be used with Windows Vista Service Pack 1 or later, or Windows 7 or later. Keep in mind that these two environments are only supported in development environments, not for production environments. In addition to Windows Server 2008 needing to be 64-bit, the SQL Server backend will also need to be a 64-bit version. SharePoint 2010 will support SQL Server 2005 Service Pack 3, SQL Server 2008 Service Pack 1, and when it's officially released, SharePoint 2010 will also support SQL Server 2008 R2. Keep in mind that all of these will be 64-bit versions only. SharePoint is unlike a traditional website where most files live on the file system of the web server. Instead, SharePoint stores the majority of its content in SQL databases. This content is served up from SQL Server to web front-end servers, where it is rendered and presented as the complete website. If you are familiar with SharePoint 2007's database structure, you will likely notice that SharePoint 2010 uses many more databases to store its content. This is because SharePoint 2010 uses dedicated databases for its new service applications. Browser support is also greatly enhanced in SharePoint 2010. This is great because SharePoint is a web-based program, and as such it is accessed through a web browser. SharePoint sites are all stored in web applications. Inside these web applications are site collections, which contain the various subsites or webs within them. SharePoint 2010 offers support for all major browsers, including Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Safari. When we talk specifically about how SharePoint 2010 is experienced in a web browser, we divide browsers into two distinct groupings, known as fully supported browsers and supported browsers with known limitations. Fully supported browsers offer the most complete experience when working with a SharePoint site. All functionality will be supported in a fully supported browser. Supported browsers with known limitations will give users most of the functionality available in SharePoint, but some features may not work as expected. SharePoint 2010 was built to be more standards-based than previous versions. This allows much better support for the use of Firefox on both PCs and Macs, and Safari on the Mac. Note that Internet Explorer 6 is not a supported browser for authoring content. For authoring content, a standards-based browser must be used. For simple browsing of a SharePoint site, most modern browsers should be able to properly render and display the site without problems. Fully supported browsers for SharePoint 2010 include Internet Explorer 7 or higher, 32-bit, and supported browsers with known limitations include Internet Explorer 7 or higher, 64-bit, or Mozilla's Firefox 3 or higher. There are also two browsers that are considered supported browsers with known limitations on non-Windows platforms. These include Firefox 3 and higher, and Safari 4 or higher. One of the big features that SharePoint 2010 brings to the table is a modular approach to services. In SharePoint 2007, shared resources, such as search, were all stored in a special web application called the Shared Service Provider, or SSP. Examples of these shared services included search, the business data catalog, Excel calculations, and user profiles. Each web application that contained SharePoint content shared a single SSP, creating extra overhead for all sites. All web applications had to be associated to one SSP. All web apps associated with that SSP shared all of the services that it provided. This included things like search index and profile store. With this setup, there was very limited flexibility. SharePoint 2010 implements a new, more flexible shared service model compared to the shared service provider in SharePoint 2007. This new model is referred to as service applications. A key benefit here is that all services are installed by default, and there is no SSP setup. This framework is much more flexible since it allows for only the needed services to be associated with a particular web application. In addition, the services can actually be shared across multiple web applications. Many of the same components that were part of the SSP are still available as service applications. The big change from the SSP to the service application approach is that now it is not necessary to have all available services running in a web application. You can pick and choose just those services you want per web application. This saves on server overhead and improves flexibility. If you decide later to add another service application to a web app, it is easy to do so from the central administration. In addition, the service applications can be shared between applications. Think of service applications as the core of the SharePoint 2010 farm. Now we will discuss some of the changes to server roles in SharePoint 2010. The same server roles that existed in SharePoint 2007 also exist in SharePoint 2010, but with some changes. There are still web front ends, application servers, and SQL servers. The biggest change will come in the application servers. They will be more heavily utilized in SharePoint 2010 to process user code, run service applications, and manage core aspects of the SharePoint farm. Just as in SharePoint 2007, the web front ends are what serves the pages to users as they are requested. The major changes to web front ends in this version is the ability to turn on performance throttling during high server load, such as high CPU requests. If the CPU becomes burdened, the web front end will kick back 503 errors to the users until the CPU has returned to normal levels. This can help prevent the server from becoming unstable. The application server is more heavily used in SharePoint 2010. In 2007, the most commonly used application server was the search indexer. In SharePoint 2010, the application server will play a much larger role. It will be responsible for hosting the majority of the shared services in the farm, such as search, Office web applications, business connectivity services, and used to host a sandbox environment for user code. This sandbox environment keeps any user-created code separate from the rest of the site, isolating its processes in the event that poorly written code causes problems with the server. Instead of taking down the entire server or site, the code will simply stop being served from the sandbox environment if it exceeds its set limit of CPU cycles. While there are not many changes to SQL Server roles in SharePoint 2010, there is one significant change related to them. SharePoint 2010 can now restore content from unattached databases. Also, SharePoint 2010 Backup and Export takes advantage of SQL snapshots, if they are available in your SQL version. With this feature, a SharePoint content database can be browsed for content to recover, even if that content is not attached to a farm. This should allow server administrators to back up and restore content with less downtime affecting end users. There is quite a bit of new terminology to familiarize yourself with regarding server administration in SharePoint 2010. Next, I'll go over and define the following new terms and what they mean in SharePoint: Enterprise Managed Metadata, Content Type Syndication, Windows PowerShell, Visual Upgrade, Best Practices Analyzer, Server Health, and Event Throttling. Enterprise Managed Metadata, or EMM. We should begin this slide by talking about what is metadata. In essence, metadata is data for data. It is a way of categorizing content. For example, a particular document may be associated with a department, such as human resources, but it may also be associated with a particular project, such as new onboarding system. In this example, department and project fields have associated values for that document, which can be considered the document's metadata. The new managed metadata allows administrators to extend and share metadata configuration across SharePoint sites or even farms. This is one of several new features to help IT professionals deliver SharePoint governance in the organization. You can now establish and control an enterprise taxonomy for all content within the entire organization. You can also centrally define taxonomies that can be leveraged within and across farms to classify and find content quickly. When tags are added by users to content and sites, these tags also automatically roll up to central administration. Enterprise managed metadata allows for hierarchies of metadata to be created and centrally managed. Terms can be created by the administrator, and specific users can be designated as owners and administrators of that managed metadata. These sets of terms are called term sets, and they can be moved, copied, or reused. Enterprise managed metadata is available from central administration. Click Manage Service Applications, and the default managed metadata service is called Managed Metadata Service. Content type syndication is another one of several new features to help you deliver SharePoint governance in the organization. Content types allow specification of content fields, policies, workflows, and other rules for a specific kind of content, such as company policy or expense report. In SharePoint 2010, content types can be defined in one site collection and reused across SharePoint sites and even across farms in conjunction with managed metadata. You can find this on the Site Collections Site Settings page. Click Content Type Publishing to get to the Setup page. Windows PowerShell. Windows PowerShell is a command-line shell and scripting language specifically designed for system administrators. In SharePoint 2010, it can be used extensively for server administration and for making some types of mass changes in your environment. Windows PowerShell supports and utilizes XML and objects. SharePoint 2010 provides a set of over 300 pre-built commandlets and supports commandlet customization. The commandlet is a single function that can be used separately or combined with other commandlets to perform complex tasks and administrative automation. Visual upgrade. When upgrading from SharePoint 2007 after a content database has been upgraded, sites will still be displayed using the Office SharePoint Server 2007 visualizations. An upgraded website can exist in one of three states in SharePoint 2010. It can exist in the Office SharePoint Server 2007 mode, the SharePoint 2010 preview mode, or the SharePoint 2010 mode. The administrator can view the site with the SharePoint 2010 user interface before committing it. This is a great new feature to be able to see the impact of the new interface on the site before the upgrade is installed. You'll know ahead of time if the transition will be a smooth one. In 2007, when you were upgrading sites from a previous version, you often had to upgrade the branding at the same time as you updated all of the data. This is not the case in SharePoint 2010. You can leverage visual upgrade to allow you to postpone the branding and use the site in the SharePoint 2007 visualizations. And then when you're ready, you can upgrade to the SharePoint 2010 branding and move to the SharePoint 2010 mode. Best Practices Analyzer. The Best Practices Analyzer is actually not a new term, but it has been improved since SharePoint 2007. The Best Practices Analyzer checks the following and makes recommendations for improvements. It checks the administrative configuration, it checks performance, it checks best practices, and it checks security issues. It can be run periodically or on demand. The results are available only to farm administrators and accessible through the central administration by clicking the Review Problems and Solutions link in the Monitoring section. The Best Practices Analyzer maintains a list of rules called Health Rule Definitions. Server Health. SharePoint 2010 includes several new tools for monitoring the health and performance of the SharePoint farm. One of these is Health Rule Definitions. Administrators set up scope, schedule, and whether to repair problems automatically. These rules can be edited, and when problems are found, remedies are suggested by the system. Sometimes the remedy suggestion even contains a web link to a Microsoft article to read for further clarification and help. An example rule is drives are running out of free space. This rule runs hourly by default. Another feature is health reports. Administrators can create a report, optionally specifying a server and or web applications to report on. Two default reports are slowest pages and top active users. There are settings for scope, schedule, and whether the rule is enabled, and whether the issue should be repaired automatically. There is also a button to run health rules now. Event throttling. Event throttling provides a way to control server resources. It allows the server to be protected from overload during peak business hours. There are large list settings that provide a way to limit the different queries within a list, which ensures that no performance issues are caused when large lists are used. This is an enhancement to manageability and is configured on the diagnostic logging pages. They determine at what level a server will go into throttling mode. By default, the server CPU, memory, requests in queue, and request wait time are being monitored. Event flood protection can also be enabled here. In summary, we covered some of how SharePoint 2010 works behind the scenes. We discussed that SharePoint 2010 is 64-bit across the board. This includes Windows Server 2008 and SQL Server 2005 and 2008. SharePoint 2010 supports most major modern browsers. Service applications take the place of shared service providers, and the roles for the servers change some, but not a lot, in SharePoint 2010. We also covered a list of important terms that apply to SharePoint 2010. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how SharePoint 2010 is set up behind the scenes. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of the webcasts.